Good morning. So as we get back into our normal routine here after the summer and I reflect back, I have to say that one of the big parts of my summer was my younger son's lacrosse tournaments all up and down the East Coast. So we spent many hours on the road in the car traveling. Now I don't remember exactly which weekend it was, but it was after a long day of getting up early and just driving on the road for many hours. And we were coming up to our exit, and I started to get off the highway, and there was a long line of cars just slowly inching to get off at the exit. But we were almost there, so I was just happy to finally almost be at our destination. And as I was sitting in the car with my wife and then my teenage son in the back who had his earphones in and was listening to some music, I see a car coming up on my left-hand side, still on the highway, and it passes by us, the long line that I was in to get off the highway. And it caught my attention. And as I look, they put their turn signal on to make a right. And I still keep watching them go all the way down the line. And sure enough, at the last moment, they cut in front of our line and got off on the exit. Now, I don't remember exactly what I said. But after whatever it was that I said, my son in the back, who I thought was not paying attention, he said, "Dad, that was not very deaconly of you." But I imagine I'm not the only one here that has kind of waited and been in that situation, right? Somebody cutting us off ahead. And so the grumbling and complaining that we probably go through when we're in that situation is totally justified, right? I mean, here we are, we're waiting our turn in line and following the rules, and sure enough, somebody comes in and they go first. So when we look at today's gospel reading, and we hear that these laborers who had been out in the field all day come in and they're complaining and grumbling to the landowner, my biggest question when I read today's gospel passage is, why would the landowner specifically tell the foreman to call all the laborers in at the end of the day, but to be sure to pay those last few laborers who came in at the end right in front of the laborers who had been there all day from the beginning? Surely that landowner had to know that there was going to be grumbling and complaining from those people. But the question is why? Why would he do that? The first shall be last, the last shall be first. What does that mean? Now, the church's traditional understanding of this parable today in Matthew's gospel is that, of course, the landowner is God. The laborers out in the vineyard who had been there from the beginning are God's chosen people, the Jewish people that God had called, beginning with Abraham, into a covenantal relationship, the promise of salvation. And they had worked all day, they had gone through all this relationship, and then at the very last moment, all the rest of us that were not Jewish, that were not the chosen people, were invited into the same salvation, the same covenant. But what is the point of this parable? And we heard it at the end. I don't know if you caught it, but the point of this is God's generosity for us. The landowner said, "Are you envious because I am generous with my money?" It's God's generosity, and God cannot be outdone in his generosity. Now, if you happen to go into Matthew's gospel and you go through this chapter that we're reading, if you skip ahead just a few verses, we come to another story where this first shall be last, last shall be first terminology also comes into play. And in this particular story, Jesus and his disciples are walking along the road, and the mother of two of his disciples, James and John, comes up to Jesus because he had been talking about entering his kingdom. And she says, "Lord, when you enter your kingdom, please reserve the seat at your left and the seat at your right for my sons, James and John, so that they can be with you in that place of honor." Now, I imagine if I were there following Jesus and I was one of his followers, that I would probably feel the same way I was when I was trying to get off the highway and somebody was trying to cut in all the way up there, right? Who is this woman that's trying to cut ahead and get her sons in the first place up next by Jesus? And so, of course, by doing this in front of everybody, there was more grumbling and complaining. And so Jesus used that opportunity to again use this first and last. And he said, "Those of you who wish to be first shall be a servant to all." If you want to be first, you need to be last. Right? And what better example of that do we have but Jesus himself? Right? And so all this grumbling, all this first shall be last, which might not make much sense to us, we even hear it today in our first reading with Isaiah. Right? The prophet tells the listeners, his ways are above our ways. We don't know, we don't understand his ways, but here we are, Jesus is breaking this down and explaining God's generosity. We need to be generous with one another. We need to be giving of ourselves to one another. And so, you and I are each created in the image and likeness of God himself. God became man. Jesus came here and gave us the perfect example of self-sacrifice, of being generous to others. And so when we leave Mass this weekend, and I know I am quite literally preaching to the choir here at St. Elizabeth's because we are such a generous parish community, but when we leave here today, maybe we can spend a few minutes reflecting on our lives and in the circles that we run and the people that we encounter, and we can explore, is there another way that we can be more generous with others? And hopefully we'll keep the grumbling to a minimum. Amen.